All righty, everybody. Good morning. This is Jeff J. Brown in early morning. It's still dark in Shenzhen, China for another China Rising Radio Sinoland podcast and article. And I am really honored to have today on the phone Mr. Jason Hirthler in New York City. How are you doing, Jason?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
Let me give all of our fans out there a little bit of a background of why we're talking together. I am an editor on the Greenville Post, and all of a sudden, so I don't know how the editor-in-chief, Patrick Granville, found you, but he picked you up and started publishing your articles on the Greenville Post. And of course, being a senior editor myself, I started reading your articles, and I was going, "Wow, this guy is really good." And I mean, I just love your writing, Jason. You really have an excellent, sort of a no-nonsense, literary style, and I really like your writing. So congratulations on that.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
And so I kept reading, and I think you've maybe posted 6, 7, 8 articles on the Greenville Post, and I think they're reprints. Where else do you do your writing, Jason?
I've written for Counterpunch. They were the first people that published me, and I've written for them for about 5 years now.
Oh, wow.
I've given them I've published a monthly piece with them pretty much every month for the last 5 years.
Oh, wow.
I also write regularly for Dissident Voice.
Yeah, Angie, I can't think of her last name right now.
Yeah, Angie's the editor.
And then Kim Peterson used to work with Dissident Voice, and he and I did a series of interviews together that were really, really popular.
Yeah,
So,
he's
Kim Peterson.
Yeah, they publish some great stuff at Dissident Voice. I'd encourage your your listeners to visit that site as well. I mean, a lot of people know Counterpunch, and I've probably published on a dozen other progressive sites and in some magazines. Sometimes I'll get into the Counterpunch print edition.
Yeah, the print edition, yeah.
Which is nice because you get that check about a month later.
I will post the search strings for you on Dissident Voice and Counterpunch so that people can start reading your stuff. And as usual, when I propose someone to do an interview, it's sort of like, what do you want to talk about? And most of mine are actual interviews. I ask questions and the person answers them. And what struck me about you, Jason, is I sort of saw a common arc of development. I mean, you're in New York. You work in, I think you work in the media, right?
Yeah, digital media.
Digital media. And I thought, God, this guy is like Thor, lobbing thunderbolts against the empire and lobbing thunderbolts, against the system, and yet there he is in New York City, working in the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
And I thought, God, how is he doing this? How is he getting away with this? And so Jason and I decided we were just going to kind of have a fireside chat, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt or Jimmy Carter with his cardigan. And just how people like you and me were able to somehow pierce the veil, and to use that movie analogy, the Matrix, step out of the Matrix, take that red pill and start to see the world as it really is. And so I think what we'll do is to start. And I did ask Jason to read the prologue of my book number 2 of the China trilogy, China Rising, which kind of goes, and I'll also post that link, and it kind of explains, not kind of, it really does, it flat out explain my arc of development from the time I was in my mother's womb until today. So, Jason's in New York. I think are you from, what part of the country are you from?
Well, I was born in Jersey, but I was raised in the South. I was raised in Atlanta.
All right.
So I was actually, my father, my parents were hippies, and they were
Oh, cool.
anti-war radicals
Oh,
and
really?
atheists, and I was a little hippie baby. And they were protesting the Vietnam War. My father was prepared to move to Canada. My mother was prepared to go with him, and my uncles, two of my uncles, signed up and fought in Vietnam and were both wounded. And so I grew up in a very interesting environment, and I obviously credit that for where my kind of anti-war convictions come from, and my interest in American foreign policy.
Wow. Wow. And they were doing this in Atlanta.
Well, no, they were I was born in Jersey, and they were from the Philadelphia area, so they were doing it in Philly, and then some in New York, and then in D.C. actually. A lot of anti-war protesting in D.C.
Wow. I really admire your parents. So, do you mind me asking how old you are, Jason?
Yeah, I'm 49.
49. Okay, I'm 63, so you're almost a generation behind me. Well, that is amazing. Okay, so you obviously became sensitized to the evils of Western Empire a lot sooner than I did.
Yeah, and it was interesting because I read your prologue, and you'd grown up in the heart of the country in Oklahoma, and gone through the air raid drills and everything, and very different from how I grew up. We moved down to the South after my parents were, I guess, emerging from the Vietnam era. We moved to the South, and when we moved there, the theme of the city, the slogan of the city, they had just elected the first African American mayor in Maynard Jackson, I think, was the first
Yeah.
African American mayor in the country.
Wow. Okay.
And the slogan of the city was "The city too busy to hate." and my father was a writer, and he was in media, like that's how I got into it. And he was writing, and his buddy was writing for the Carter campaign, and I met Jimmy Carter when he was on the campaign trail when I was very little. And it was an interesting environment. And my father had been inspired by the civil rights movement, of course, and he would feed me books about all of these civil rights leaders. And I read Let the Trumpet Sound, the great story of MLK. And over the years, I met MLK, Daddy King. I met Martin Luther King's father. I met.
Oh wow! And so this is in Atlanta, right?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I met Jesse Jackson.
I voted for Jesse Jackson in 1988 in the primaries.
Yeah.
He won the Democratic primary in Oklahoma in 1988.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
He was an inspiring, still is an inspiring figure. And I met John Lewis.
Wow.
And my father is actually friends with Andy Young,
Wow,
who
amazing.
I always admired for his. I always admired him because I think he was Carter's representative to the United Nations, and he spoke to the PLO, and he talked to the PLO and met with them, and that was something that American ambassadors didn't do, and I think he lost his job for that.
Yeah. I'm sure AIPAC, the American-Israeli Political Action Committee, came out and destroyed him for that.
Yeah. So I kind of grew up in that milieu, and from there, so I always had an interest. But like you said, it takes a long time to, I guess, unlearn. I was reading something recently. There's a spiritual teacher I like named Anthony DeMello. I don't know if you've ever read him.
Just know the name.
Yeah. He was a Jesuit priest who was he kind of had an enlightenment experience and began to teach kind of a much broader vision of spirituality than just the Christian faith, and he was actually excommunicated by
the church.
Benedict before
wow.
he became. But he had written a book, and he had talked about what he called the process of unlearning. And there are so many things that we ultimately have to unlearn in life before we can see the truth. And I kind of saw a similar theme in your story. And for me, I was raised in a very, on the one hand, I was exposed to the civil rights movement and the legacy of that, but I was also raised in a strict Christian Southern environment where I was in a Christian academy. So I was kind of inculcated in this very kind of a Southern Baptist environment.
Okay.
And that was something to some degree
well, actually, it shouldn't. It's not a dichotomy. I mean, when Jesus was a communist. I mean,
yeah.
There really is no dichotomy. But in the mainstream, in mainstream, there's this very careful divide between what Jesus was saying, and I'm an atheist. I mean, but I do understand. I've lived in the Arab world for 10 years, and the Muslim world for 10 years, and grew up in Oklahoma, and have some very devout family members, and
sure.
And so Jesus. There really should not be any conflict because,
no.
But it's carefully parsed. There's a line where you don't cross. Where what Jesus did and said, and but he was basically a communist. So,
well, you said you had Nietzsche on your bedside
Nietzsche. Oh yeah,
table.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Nietzsche said, well, there was one Christian and he died on a cross.
Yeah, that's right.
Hasn't been one since, but
And then we had pictures of Jesus back during the Vietnam War, carrying an M1 rifle, and the muscular Jesus, and
yeah.
Well, okay, so you obviously were light years. Excuse me, you were light years ahead of me. I mean, I didn't really. It wasn't until I came back here in 2000. I mean, I knew, that things were not right. I had this unsettling feeling in my gut that things were not right. But capitalism was sacrosanct, and I even voted for Obama in 2012, and I didn't the second, or is it 2008? Yeah, 2008, and I sure didn't vote for him in 2012. But so what do you But still, I mean, so you were in this sort of liberal Christian environment. There is still, as I think you will agree with me, and I was sort of that way too after traveling all over the world, and I was kind of ranting against the rich people but still capitalism was sacrosanct. Still, America was great, and still America was noble and just, and our system was better. What triggered you to just finally sort of like rip the veil off your face and the scales off your eyes and all the other metaphors, where you realized that under all that, in spite of Jimmy Carter, who had Zbigniew Brzezinski as his, he was the one that started Afghanistan, and
yep.
And he was the one that built up the military. I mean, Reagan basically just latched onto his coattails, and I mean, it was actually Carter who exploded the military budget. So where did you, and how and why? What were your triggers that you realized that under all that good stuff that your parents were doing, that underneath, our leaders are evil imperialists? I mean, walk us through that, Jason?
Well, it's funny. In our email exchange, you had suggested a kind of a theme of what did you call it? A dupe?
Yeah, from dupe to enlightened. Enlightened anti. Well, I don't know. I can't remember what it was I said. We'll come up with something for the title together.
Well, I voted for George H.W. Bush, and my sole reason for voting for him was that we needed to be strong on defense.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was, that was, as a young guy, that was largely the extent of my political knowledge. And actually, my first job, I went in and I was going to be like a kind of a news reporter. I was going to create little digests of all these different news stories in the technology industry. And they had just let somebody go or she had left because of her political opinions.
Wow.
And they asked me, and my first interview at this place, they said, it was an information services company, and they sat me down, and the three principals sat across the table for me. I'm like 22 at the time, and they say, tell us about your political views. And I was such a political zombie, they realized they could count on me. I knew nothing, I knew nothing except we needed to be strong on defense.
Oh, yeah,
and I did a good job for them, just kind of reporting. But it was interesting because I started following some of the Hindu and Muslim conflicts in I guess Gujarat in the early 90s. And I started reporting on some of that, and it was funny, they never stopped me, but it was like totally unrelated to anything else I was reporting on about technology. But I was kind of interested in so I think I've always had something of a contrarian spirit and a intellectual curiosity, which is always dangerous. But the main trigger, I would say, is I was reading Rolling Stone one day, and there was an interview. Jerry Brown, I guess he's still the governor in California.
Yeah. He was just in China this summer. He visited with Xi Jinping. Yeah, I even wrote an article about it.
He's like a picture perfect neoliberal, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he was interviewing in Rolling Stone, and he was interviewing Noam Chomsky.
Oh,
and
really?
I'd heard of Chomsky, and Noam Chomsky was dropping bombs about foreign policy that I had never heard before. And it made such an impression on me that I just couldn't forget it. And so I started investigating. I read a couple of his books, and I basically started studying foreign policy, American foreign policy, and, domestic policies related to that, but mostly foreign policy. And eventually I started reading David Harvey and some of the spatial geographers that explore the growth of capitalism. And I started to tie foreign policy into global economics and neoliberalism, and, always trying to kind of create a more comprehensive worldview or picture of the way things are. And so that's how I got into it. And I've been reading and studying it ever since. I've just been fascinated with it. I was actually on the ground for the WTO protests in Seattle in 1999.
Oh, good for you. Wow.
And I was also down at Occupy. I was more of, I wasn't on the front lines. I was kind of I saw a lot of police repression in both protests, but both of those protests made an impact on me, and I started writing about it. But I really studied and read voluminously for about 20 years before I ever wrote anything or submitted anything for publication about politics, because it's such a complicated field.
Yeah.
And I have a background as a writer, but that was always, in digital. And now I'm a strategist and a writer. So as a professional, I promote sports events and things like that, which, I actually have an interest in. But some of the tactics that we'll use, like making sure we're on all the different media channels that people are reading, and if we're promoting a sports event, some of the same tactics are used by people creating what I would call black propaganda, which is the news media. So I think I see a connection there, and I know a lot of people think, well, God, advertising is the worst thing in the world, and I think it's certainly overdone, but I think marketing a product is fundamentally okay. And the products, I try to stick to products that I either support or I like and things like that. But nevertheless, I mean, there are contradictions there. And one of the things that's interesting, though, is that when you're advertising a product, you're saying, okay, this is what here's a boxing match on HBO. This is, it's a great fight. You know, I like boxing, so I'm into that. And this is a good fight between two middleweights. Here's I'll do a list of details about the fight, and that's that. So you know what I'm marketing. But the news media, my definition of propaganda, one of my definitions is it's advertising masquerading as journalism.
Yeah, yeah.
So on the side, when you're reading the New York Times and you're reading about the run up to the Iraq War, the Washington Post, and they have an editorial board op-ed that says there's almost no one who would be willing to deny that Saddam Hussein
has weapons of mass destruction.
So you're reading that and you're thinking, okay, this is objective journalism. But what it really is an advertising campaign for the defense industry.
Yeah,
you know?
Exactly. Headed by the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Yeah, so that's where I kind of draw the line. And my writing has largely been around foreign policy, but then also exploring the propaganda elements that trying to uncover some of the lies and some of the deceptions that are involved in the main.
Well, it is. It's fake news. I mean, it's been fake probably for 200 years. I mean, but at least since World War II, and well, heck, I mean, even I forgot the name of the book, but someone wrote a great book about the Spanish-American War, and I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, William Randolph Hearst.
Sure.
And there was a senator and the Secretary of State back then. I can't remember what it was in the early 1890s, and they were looking for a war. I mean, they were even talking. They were looking to create a global empire, and they even considered attacking a British colony just to they thought that they could go against Britain at the height of their imperial power. And the famous quote by William Randolph Hearst, I can't remember exactly what it was, but something to the effect that you give me the story and I'll sell you a war. I mean, I will provide you with a war. And that's exactly what they did. The USS Maine, we'll never know, but there's about a 95% chance that it was a false flag. Perpetrated by our own government, and 200 and something soldiers were killed in the harbor of in Havana Harbor, somewhere in Cuba, and blah blah, and bam, all of a sudden, we take over the Philippines and Cuba and Guam, and so yeah, you're right. I mean, it's just it's frightening. Let me ask you this: you're involved in the media, Jason. And just by some sort of, alignment of the stars, in the last couple of weeks, I was at a professional development meeting, and I mentioned to these teachers, I said, I talked about Edward Bernays, who wrote a book called Propaganda, and I told them about the Lucky Strike, his famous Lucky Strike cigarette campaign, which was tailored after basically the Nazi big propaganda, big lie strategies. And then she mentioned, and then one of the teachers that I was with said, "Oh yeah, I heard about the Lucky Strike thing on Mad Men," and I just knew the name of the show. Can you take us back to Edward Bernays and just how he basically wrote the playbook, and is he still talked about in your circles? I mean, is he admired? In like digital marketing, nobody even knows who he is. Okay.
I think some people in PR might be aware of him. But even in PR, which is kind of a different field in a way, although there's some overlap now. Even in PR, I don't think PR people recognize that their field kind of emerged as a propaganda arm of corporate industry.
Yeah.
It was called human relations. One of the people that best encapsulates or explains that era, if you want to go from that the Spanish American War that you were describing, right after that, if you want to go from the build up to World War I all the way through World War II into the McCarthy phase and beyond, the best history I've read of that is by a writer named Alex Carey. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Alex and then Terry, Terry.
Carey, Carey.
Oh, C-A-R, okay. I'll write that down and include it in the article.
He wrote a book called, and it's a great title, he wrote a book called Taking the Risk Out of Democracy. Okay. And it's all about the various campaigns, most of them anti-socialist campaigns that have come like waves through American culture. From the first big one was Woodrow Wilson set up the Creel Commission, which kind of brought the American society, which was leaning in a pacifist direction, kind of into a frothing furor in which they were anxious to get involved in the war and attack the Huns, who they were convinced were a big threat. And then there were several, in the 30s, there were several anti-union, anti-socialist campaigns in the teens and the 30s, and then leading up into the McCarthy era. And he describes a lot of that, how he talks about the funding and where the American Business Council was behind a lot of it. And it's fascinating. And Bernays was one of the godfathers of PR, along with Walter Lippmann. And, it's interesting that Lucky Strike campaign, I think that was the one where he popularized it by having all the women in a women's march in New York City who were on the front of the march smoking Lucky Strikes.
Yeah, and they were suffragettes, and with signs about freedom.
Yeah,
and they had the same color dresses and hats as the package of Lucky Strike. I mean, it was really and it worked. I mean, he basically launched cigarette smoking among women.
Yeah, I know, and it's talk about a misuse of identity politics.
Yeah,
but maybe the first, and it's interesting though, because he was able to do that, and in doing that, he identified cigarettes with independence.
Yeah, exactly.
And that sunk into the American conscience. And I remember reading him. If you read, I think it's Propaganda.
His book is called Propaganda, and he just comes out and says he's the one that coined public relations. He realized that the word propaganda had become sort of a dirty word because of the Nazis.
Sure.
He just switched it. He just created the word public relations to replace propaganda, and said so in his book.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's insidious in some ways, but it's very clever. Like when he talks about, I think he talks about having a client that wanted to sell pianos. He says, well, how do you sell pianos? Do you put leaflets out? Do you put an ad in the paper? You can do that, but there are other ways to do it. And what he did is he made a deal. He cut a deal with furniture showrooms. And all of these furniture showrooms that had, the great couches, the great credenzas, the great dining room tables, he got them to include a piano in all of their showrooms. And it kind of created this sense that if you were an upwardly mobile family in America and you wanted to really create the perfect ensemble, upper class ensemble and living room to impress your guests, you had to have a piano.
Yeah.
And sales took off.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of fascinating how he understood that, but he was Sigmund Freud's nephew, so it's not surprising.
Yeah. And then you started getting all the product placement in the 1950s TV shows.
Sure,
You know,
sure, yeah.
plugging this and plugging that, and well, what shocks me, Jason, is I mean, you even bring up false flags in your articles now. I mean, you're really, I mean, you are outside the matrix. I mean, you realize that that your parents were, your parents were most of the way there, but you have really, gone outside the matrix like me. And how are you able to write like you are? I mean, you basically, calling the West for what it is, evil, racist. Like me. You're probably anti-capitalist, anti-war. I think you probably have about as much respect for the Democrats now as I do, and liberal, phony, caviar liberals, and I'm not relating your parents to that, but my parents were liberal too. I mean, they were, by Oklahoma standards, were very, very liberal. In fact, my grandmother on my dad's side worked for Franklin Delano Roosevelt in Illinois. So within
Wow.
the milieu of arch conservative Oklahoma, I came also from a liberal background. But somehow you and I have managed to go beyond our parents, as much as we love them and as much as they have done, as much as they did for us. And how you got outside the matrix. You're talking about the evils of the whole system, and not just the Republicans and the neocons. And you talk about false flags now, and I saw that in one of your articles. How are you able to keep your job?
That's a good question. I mean, I guess I don't work on projects that are directly, I don't work on any political projects. I mean, I just basically I help market sports.
Okay.
That's what I do, and occasionally some music things. I just kind of do music and digital marketing for music and for sports, which I don't see any contradictions in that. I'm happy to that's what I like doing. But and I know a lot of people. Chomsky talks about how it's all a huge distraction, but I also think we need pastimes, and I think some of our pastimes are good. And I love basketball, so I like promoting the NBA and that kind of stuff. But insofar as I've been asked, as a contractor, I've been asked to work on certain accounts, and like I was asked to get involved with the CFR and work on some CFR stuff.
Oh, really? The Council of Foreign Relations. I mean, that's CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff Central.
Oh, I know. And I turned it down flat, and I said, look, I don't support what they do, and I don't want to support what they do.
Okay.
So I just try to, maybe one day I'll be out on the street without any work available, but I haven't had too many run-ins. Occasionally I have to, I turn something down, or I say I don't want to work on that account, or that kind of thing. But for the most part, I keep it to things that I like doing.
But you have not had a situation where, you're working on, an MBA contract, and someone sends you an email and says, "Hey, I read your article, in the Greenville Post or our Counterpunch, and do you really believe in this shit?" I mean, that hasn't happened to you.
Well, people have, like, my boss used it. He saw something that I was on RT, and he used it as a joke in a meeting one time. And for when you're working with agencies, I haven't hid any of the stuff, and it's out there, and there's no way for me to bury it or anything like that. So I just figure, well, if they find it, they find it, and if I own up to my anti-war views, and if they don't like it, they don't have to hire me.
Yeah.
I'll find something else to do.
Yeah.
But I've always been interested in writing and strategy, and for my father was in the Olympic business and promoting Olympic games, so I've always been interested in that side of the business, and so I do the work where I can get it, and if I don't get it, if they don't like me, I definitely think I've been turned down for some jobs because
of your
they've
politics.
because of that. And
They've done
but I
they've
haven't
done a
been.
Google search, and
Yeah.
there you
Yeah, and
are.
I've been unapologetic about it, and that's fine. They can. For me, honestly, I'm just I'm making a living, and I don't make any money off of the political writing that I do, or very little. So, but that's actually the more important writing for me, the more
Yeah.
important topics. So I'd rather give the one up than the other.
So we can both say that we're sort of out of the anti-imperial, anti-capitalist closet, as it were.
Yeah.
But but I think we have to empathize with people. You're an independent contractor. I'm over here in China, and they know, that my politics. But it's an international school, and it doesn't really, they don't really, so far it hasn't affected me. But I have used Sinclair Lewis's no Upton Sinclair, who wrote The Jungle, one of the great investigative journalists back in the 19 was it the teens or the 20s? But he wrote The Jungle and exposed the meat
That's a
pack,
great book.
yeah,
Yeah.
the meat packing industry, and he ran as a socialist, for as a socialist. I think it was as a senator in New York, and one of his famous lines was, "And it's hard to get a man to understand something when his paycheck depends on him not understanding it."
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
so I think,
Yeah.
we do have to, I think he was probably frustrated, and I'm sure there's a lot of our readers out there and fans out there who want to say something at work, who want to say something with their family, who want to, hey, did you read this? I just read this great article by Jason Hirthler. I just listened to this great podcast by Jeff Brown, who, God, the nut job lives in communist China, and this is what he said. And I think there's a lot of people out there that are in the closet. I think they still are in the anti-imperial, anti-capitalist closet, and they're
Well,
just.
I hope so. I mean, that's a good question. Are they? Are most people that we work with, and or where people are working regular jobs, do they have more radical views that they're just not expressing for fear of losing their job, or
Yeah, I don't
or do they
know.
just hold mainstream neoliberal views?
Yeah, well, and yeah, and I presume that there's a few of them, that, like you said, you have to start researching. You have to start
Yeah.
reading other things besides the New York Times. I mean, I have a friend who used to work for the New York Times. He said everybody there knows it's CIA. He said everybody there knows that it's a CIA, chop shop. I mean, it is, and the
Hmm.
Washington Post, and the Mockingbird, the Mockingbird thing with the CIA controlling the
Yeah.
press. That nothing's changed, and so I think there's a lot of, you have to at least balance that with reading people like you and me, and the Greenville Post, and Counterpunch, and in fact, in China Rising, my second book of the trilogy, and my third book, I mean, I even devoted an entire chapter in each book. Here is what I read. Here is what I research,
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to encourage people to, and what I tell them is quit. Just turn the damn TV and the damn radio off, and just stop listening to NPR. Stop listening,
Yeah.
watching CNN. If you think the Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post are enlightened liberalism,
Yeah.
it's a mirage. It's delusional.
People
And
don't want to give that up.
yeah, I know. And
Like we were saying, how Bernays said that, he put a piano in all of these gorgeous furniture showrooms. Well, on top of that piano was probably a copy of the New York Times
Yeah,
or the
exactly.
Sunday Times.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like
yeah, yeah,
if
yeah,
you
yeah.
don't read the Sunday Times, you're not
Yeah.
cultured.
Or Life magazine.
Yeah, yeah, and those are
The Luces.
they're cultural. I don't know what the word is.
Icons,
They're
icons.
cultural icons, and if you don't engage with them, you feel left out on some
Yeah,
level. It's very
yeah,
strange.
yeah. Well, but unfortunately, it works. I mean, that's what's so frightening about it is that it does work. And I was brainwashed. It wasn't, and I was brainwashed even after I got here in 2010. But I really started seeing, the China being a communist country and how much it had changed since we had lived here for 7 years in the early 90s, and that kind of. Even when I got here back in 2010, I still thought Hillary and Bill were, wonderful leaders, and but it wasn't until I took my trip, all over China, and wrote my first book, China Rising, in 44 days backpacking in China, which is kind of it's basically a geopolitical chronicle. And that's when I really, and I'll tell you, your trigger was that interview with Noam Chomsky, and Jerry Brown. Mine was watching a clip of the World Trade Center building number 7 coming down. In 9/11,
the one that wasn't hit.
Yeah, the one that wasn't hit. And, I'm a science teacher. I'm a certified, a state certified science teacher, and taught science for 3 years back in the United States. And I'm sitting there, I'm going, you know what? That's not possible. And so that's when I started doing my research. So basically, realizing, and it was just like this horrific onion that I was peeling, and I was crying, emotionally and intellectually, when I was going, my God, the 9/11 was not 19 Saudis with box cutters, who completely brought down the entire the strategic defense system in the United States. It was our government that did this. And when I realized that they were evil enough to kill 3,000 people, but they're killing millions overseas, and so I think that's the hard part, is people, they're so divorced from the slaughter and the genocide and the exterminations that we're perpetrating overseas, but they basically did the same thing in New York and every other false flag, before and since. I mean, so they have no, human life is nothing, and if it means maintaining power. So that was that for me was the event that basically deflated, the Wizard of Oz for me, and helped me step out of the matrix. So
it's really hard to break through that. Like, I remember you mentioned Obama, you voted for Obama. I remember in 2008 talking to a lot of people who were, had grown up in the civil rights era and were so excited, for good reasons, to see an African American with even a shot at taking the White House.
Yeah.
And to them, that was just a tremendous kind of confirmation of what they had marched for and what they had believed in, their liberal values, which, those good values. And I had a hard time discussing it with them because it was hard to get past that. And I could acknowledge, yes, but I tried to use analogies like, to me, it was like, say we're, it's France, it's revolutionary France, and they're guillotining all these people, and there's a movement, a female movement that says, well, look, all of the people running the guillotines are French men. We need some women manning the guillotines. So, they have this campaign, and they get a woman, to chop off the heads of the people. And I felt like, well, is it really? In one sense, it is progress. In another sense, boy, is it progress?
Yeah, he turned out to be just an extension of the Reagan Bush Clinton, Bush administration. I mean, it's just been one long horror show. Well, you can, to be honest with you, you can go back a long time before that. I mean, the last guy that tried, to do something about this was John F. Kennedy, and they blew his brains out, in Dallas, and so, it's. I don't know if we've accomplished what we want, but you have stepped out of the closet. I don't even, and to make the last piece of the puzzle for me, and it's just been in the last couple of years. I mean, if everybody thinks that, I popped out of my mom's womb like this, I wasn't. This has been a long, arduous, conflicting experience for me to tear down all these walls and cut through all the propaganda. The last piece of the puzzle to make the cipher that I needed to realize everything and how it works is capitalism. And we are so brainwashed in the United States and the West in general that capitalism is like it's a religion, it's a god, it's sacrosanct. You can't say anything bad about it. But that was that last piece for me, as I realized that, well, I was sort of the racism, what you grew up with. I had that, and I had this, and then I kind of got, and then after I wrote my first book, like the colonialism, and because I researched all about the century of humiliation for the Chinese and with the British and the Europeans here. And so I kind of had that piece, the colonialism and the racism, and I kind of tied those two together. And then the empire. Oh yeah, we're an empire. We're an empire. And God, I didn't know that. And so I kind of tied that, and I had those three pieces in, and then the war, and then I researched genocide, and Western genocide, but that final piece, and I only got it in the last couple of years, was this is all driven by basically racism and capitalism are the foundations of what drives the West, and as an expression of my outrage and disillusionment with capitalism, and just I have two passports. I have a French passport and an American passport, and I joined the Communist Party of France as a way to express my outrage at capitalism, and I also joined the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, and I pay my dues to both of them, and so now I'm I'm like you. When people talk to me, I'm out of the closet. I mean, I tell people, this is how I feel, and if I lose my job, I lose my job, and we're going to retire next year anyway. I'm going to be 64 next year. So it can be done. It can be done, but and you've done it, and I've done it in our own unique ways.
Yeah, because I honestly feel that I have nothing to be ashamed about, and there's nothing to hide. I mean, I would ask people, what is a patriot? What is patriotism? And I think patriotism is the willingness to, and the desire to make your country better, and the willingness to critique it. And I think we need that. And I think people that are blindly supporting the troops and blindly supporting U.S. policy, I think that's unpatriotic.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a minority view, but they're defunding or they're deranking RT, the channel RT, and Google is doing that.
And the Greenville Post.
All of
the World Socialist website, hundreds of websites.
Hard hit.
They're literally destroying. They're basically going in and basically writing algorithms to snuff them out of internet search.
Absolutely, and the thing is that all of those like channels like RT, if you watch them, and places like the Greenville Post and the World Socialist website and Counterpunch and all these other progressive spots, they are full of patriots.
Yeah.
Who are trying to argue that their country needs to turn in a new direction. And, I just get so tired of being bludgeoned with one movie after another, one commercial after another, one op-ed after another about our heroic troops, slaughtering villagers in, any number of Middle East countries.
Well,
We're sitting in Las Vegas,
and movies and TV shows.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can't watch Homeland, or it's like they're really producing. Hollywood is coming out with a different pro-war movie every 6 months now. It seems. Yeah. Or every 3 months.
It's not an accident.
No. So I find that, if we get the opportunity to talk about these things, we should, and we have nothing to be ashamed for. And I always say, and I feel like in this country, liberals have come to, all they really care about to some degree is that their candidates are anti-racist, pro-LGBTQ, pro-feminism,
all the identity politics.
And I relate to them on that level, and I'm those things too. But at the same time, I say, okay, healthcare is important, but what about the 18 million people in Syria and the 6 million people in Libya who lost their healthcare as a direct result of Obama and Clinton policies?
Yeah. And the bombing of Serbia and the radioactive...
The bombing of brown people.
The brown people, what I call the dark-skinned people.
Yeah. So, and I would like to get back to that point you made earlier about capitalism being maybe the final veil that you had to see through, how implicit that was to the situation we're in. I wanted to ask you, because probably a lot better than me, like, if you read The Economist, which I read religiously for years,
I did too,
or any of these neoliberal economic rags, they will say capitalism has lifted 400, 600 Chinese out of poverty in the last 20 years. And then you write a book, and they will take credit for that, but you write a book and says China is communist, damn it.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about the idea that they're just kind of co-opting Chinese successes for their neoliberal project?
I wrote in both China Rising and China's Communist, damn it, that this didn't start in 1980 with Deng Xiaoping. I mean, this started in 1949 with Mao Zedong.
Yeah.
And he is the one that laid the foundation. Without him, Deng would have never been able to succeed. He couldn't have gotten 1 centimeter off the ground. And so it is the 800 million Chinese that have been brought out of poverty since 1949. And what people don't realize is that, in 1980, China was already a middle-income country with an amazing, really decent infrastructure, but it wasn't enough. And they had industry, they had agriculture, they had military, they had the H-bomb, they had, satellites in space. I mean, they like to portray that when Deng took over in 1980, that somehow, China was, some, hellhole, like Africa, some African hellhole. It was not rich. It was not, they did not have, Sony Walkmans in every home, but they were a powerhouse, agricultural, military, technology, industrial, powerhouse, but at the middle income level. And the problem is that with at that point 1 billion people, you average it out, and it just was not enough. And they probably could have forged ahead and taken the Cuba, Eritrea model and push forward and make it work. But Deng simply wanted to short circuit the Marxist timeline where the West had the Industrial Revolution and massive industrialization in order to transition from capitalism to socialism and then eventually to communism. Deng wanted to have that sort of industrialization within his own country to create the wealth, the consumer wealth that the West had in order to transition from socialism to communism, and so that's what he did. But for the Economist and the Financial Times and all these other, as you say, neoliberal, publications, they want to pretend that it started in 1980. It didn't start in 1980. It started in 1949 when Mao kicked out the Americans, the Brits, the French, the Japanese, kicked out every capitalist, nationalized all the property, nationalized all the businesses. There's no private real estate over here. It's all public. There's no private banks. There's no private insurance companies. There's the half the economy is state owned, and so
you never read about that here.
No, well, read my books.
Exactly.
Read Jason Hirthler's articles on Counterpunch and the Greenville Post.
Yeah.
And but anyway, we've been going for almost an hour, and we need to. I've got to go to work, so I think you probably. Yeah, and you've got to, and you're going to.
I've got to go to dinner.
You're going to go to Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah.
So I don't know if we accomplished our mission, which was to try to help inspire people to maybe step out of the closet, the anti-imperial, anti-capitalist, closet. But if one person just does do that and steps out of the closet and starts talking at the water cooler and starts talking with their family members and starts talking at church and wherever, or the temple or whatever, if they start doing that, if one person does that, I think our hour together was worth it.
I do too.
And so you've done it, I've done it, you still have a job, I still have a job. It can be done.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's right. It may be nuanced, but I think the big thing that we both agree is you've got to stop, you've got to pull the plug on the mainstream media, and you've got to branch out and start reading stuff like you write about and I write about, and the Greenville Post and the Counterpunch, and I'll put all these links on the article. So, Jason, thank you so much for being on China Rising Radio Sinoland, and I've really enjoyed talking with you. I'm really impressed with your background, and give your mom and dad a big hug for me. I think they're obviously pretty terrific people to do what they've done. And
you know what, Paul Street, real quick, Paul Street, he's a terrific writer. He writes on Counterpunch sometimes. He wrote an article the other day, and it said, "Thank an anti-war veteran today." And I thought that, that's a good idea. I need to thank my parents for. That's a great idea.
And we can close out by saying, thank an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist writer.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to find your stuff. I'm looking forward to getting some of your books, and especially the China's Communist, damn it.
All right.
It looks good.
And we'll stay in touch, Jason, and I'll keep reading your stuff. And I'm sure Patrice at the Greenville Post will put this on the Greenville Post website, and of course it'll be on China Rising Radio Sinoland. And again, thanks a million for being on, and go enjoy an anti-imperial, anti-colonial.
I'll do my best
with your friends there in New York City.
Thanks, Jeff. Appreciate it.
Talk to you later.
All right. So long.
Bye-bye.